This is Conversation Balloons, a podcast of interviews with experts and friends about all things generational. I'm your host, Leah Farish. Special thanks to our sponsor, the Herzog Foundation. You will be delighted to hear today from my guest, Leland Vittert. He's Chief Washington Anchor at News Nation and host of On Balance there, and was previously an anchor and foreign correspondent at Fox News. We will be talking about his new book, which is number 4 on the New York Times bestseller list. It's a memoir called Born Lucky: A Dedicated Father, a Grateful Son, and My Journey with Autism. So glad to have you on, Leland.
Leah, thank you. Good to be here.
You have called this book a story of parental love. How so?
So, Born Lucky is a message of hope for every parent who has a kid who's struggling. Doesn't matter if it's autism or ADHD or anxiety, whatever it is, bullying at school. Born Lucky is proof of the power that parents have, which is incredible, but it is not often talked about or celebrated. And you think about where I was at about 6 or 7 years old when my parents were told that they needed to have me evaluated, right? So in Born Lucky, we tell you the story of my parents with their firstborn child thinking, obviously, there's things that were wrong because, behaviorally, if somebody touched me in the lunch line, I'd turn around and slug them. I would melt down because of all sorts of sensory issues. If I had socks on that I didn't like or a jacket or whatever, I would melt down. And I was starting to have learning issues. So they take me in to get evaluated, and they're waiting there in one of those medical testing buildings, in that with the old magazines and the stale coffee and linoleum floors. 2 hours later, the woman comes back with me and says it's very difficult to understand what's going on inside his head. But among the behavioral and sensory issues I had, I also had really terrible learning issues. So IQ score is 2 halves of a test. Typically, learning disability is represented by a 20-point spread between the 2 halves. Mine was a 70-point spread. They'd never seen a spread that big. And, my dad, as any parent would say, after being just, sort of knocked down by hearing all the bad things, said, "What can we do?" And the woman says, "Generally not much." And he goes, "Is there anything we can do?" And she says, "Not really." That sort of began this process for my dad. And Born Lucky is the story of hope for parents and power for parents that he really didn't understand that he had at that moment.
Well, it certainly is. And I really I listened to the book, or I would hold it up for the audience. But one thing I noticed was that as your father raised you, and he really sacrificed, he quit his outside work and really focused on holding you together, putting you back together every day. But that he held you to a moral compass. Mm-hmm. He didn't lower his standards, his idea of virtue and absolutes. And that I'm struck by that because in my framework of anthropology, we all have a conscience. We all have different skills and abilities and deficits, but we do have a conscience, and that needs to be cultivated in children. And the work ethic, the emphasis on honesty that he had, I think is unusual for parents who know their children have real challenges in this world. I really admire how he approached that.
It's a great point. And he realized early on I was not going to be able to have friends because of all the, sort of behavioral issues I had and lack of understanding of the human equation. He realized I wasn't going to be good at sports and I wasn't going to be good at school. So those are the 3 things that kids normally get self-esteem from. Mm-hmm. And that was a real challenge for him of how do I give my son self-esteem, right? And he started by saying there's 2 things that he can control. Number one, he can control his character. And number two, he can control his work ethic. And those were the two things dad worked at. And you have to think about it this way, Leah, dad, and we take you through in Born Lucky, defines himself by his character. Why? Because when he was 16 years old, he was standing there shaving, getting ready for a date in the upstairs of the house he grew up in. And his older brother, who was about 10 years older, walks in and says to my dad, our father died. My dad's dad, my grandfather. And they go down on a rainy night in November in St. Louis to the office building that my grandfather had a little construction company in. They open the safe in the office, and there is a letter to my dad and his brother, my uncle. And it says, you're not defined by your achievements or your money or your success. You're defined by your character. And that is the bedrock principle that dad has always lived by, that there were two things that his dad always talked about, which was hard work and character. And that's what he began to try to import to me as the two things that, as a little kid who wasn't good at anything and who was having all these problems, that I could take pride in, because those were the two things that you could always control.
Well, you've certainly manifested work ethic and character. You were flying a plane when you were 11 years old. I'm still astounded at that. There is no lower age limit for flying planes, is there?
Yeah, well, no, I had an instructor with me, and this wasn't as much about just flying the airplane as it was about teaching me that hard work and sticking with something and working for something mattered. So, when I was about 5 or 6, I realized I saw in the news a story about a kid who had flown across the country, and I said I wanted to beat him. So that's setting goals. And then it was so much hard work went into even my dad talking about looking into flying lessons, of reading and of doing doing extra math work and extra reading work to try and get to the point that I could understand the textbooks that were required to learn how to fly and to pass the exams and everything else. And then sticking with it, even though I would throw up during or after most flights. So all of those things worked together for my dad to find something, again, that even as a kid who had no friends and was struggling horrifically in school, that I could take pride in. And I could work on. And those were things that he focused. And that's that's the Born Lucky story, really, why it applies to all parents, of the ways that he picked out and helped me through things. And I think the most important part of this, right, was dad wanted to adapt me to the world, not the world to me. And for him, adversity was something that you got through. Adversity was your friend. So many parents want to take adversity away from their kid, understandable. He said, I'm going to hold your hand through the adversity.
And that certainly shapes character. He gave you skills in just understanding. He'd point to his watch when you were talking for going on too long. He would help you develop these interpersonal skills that some people have naturally, and he taught them to you. And emphasized, like you said, perseverance, never giving up. But should we have a concern that the parent of a child that reads your book might conclude, oh, my child just isn't trying hard enough?
Well, I don't know. I'm not a parent, right? So it's hard for me to answer that. People have asked me for my advice after reading the book or listening to it or whatever. And I don't have any advice because I'm not a parent. I'm just me. And I think, the best advice, or if there is, comes from my dad in the afterword, speaking to parents. And, it starts with have no expectations. That was rule number one that my dad laid out for himself. This is, when he was sort of in the depths of realizing the troubles and the difficulties I was having. The one thing that my dad really pressed upon me was that you have to keep trying, right? And you can never use your diagnosis as an excuse. He never told me about my diagnosis until I was in my 20s. And I think that was because he never wanted me to be defined by it. He never wanted me to place it as a limiting factor on myself, or to use it as well, I can't do that because of whatever. Uh, I think that people have also said, well, not everybody can be cured, and I'm putting that in air quotes, of autism or something like that. And I'm not. This is an everyday journey and an everyday struggle. And I'll give you an example. Just a couple of weeks ago, I was playing golf with my father-in-law, and we're playing with this nice older man. We have a lot of great conversations, good laughs on the golf course. And as we get ready to leave the golf course, I'm running late and I need to pack my golf clubs into my travel bag. So I'm down on the ground packing them into the travel bag. And one thing about autism is you can become very task focused, right? You're just totally task oriented. So I'm trying to not be late. And the gentleman we played golf with walks over to us and starts talking to me. And I ignore him. I was just phenomenally rude. And one of the very important things that my dad always taught me was just sort of the importance of being polite, the importance of being thoughtful and emotionally present with people and looking them in the eye, and no matter who they are. And I just blew this guy off because I was just so focused on trying to pack the golf bag. So this man stands over me probably for 5 minutes trying to talk to me, and I'm just completely ignoring him. And even at the moment as it was happening, I realized, like, Lucky, you're being really rude. You need to stop packing the golf bag. And I couldn't help myself. He eventually just leaves, walks away. And I sent him a text message about 2 days later, and I said, I just want to apologize to you for how rude I was. I know better. I'm sorry I was wrong. I didn't then follow it up by saying, and by the way, I have autism, because my dad said, he never wanted to let me use anything as an excuse.
I need to jump in here and tell you that Conversation Balloons is now part of the Herzog Foundation podcast network. The Herzog Foundation is dedicated to strengthening Christian education and helping families and schools pass faith and wisdom from one generation to the next. You'll still hear the same great commercial-free conversations, now supported by a foundation that shares our heart for truth and understanding across generations. You can learn more at herzogfoundation.com. I didn't have a lot of emotional challenges when I was little. I had a lot of physical suffering, and it was isolating and it was hard. And my mother, who was a registered nurse, did not encourage self-pity. She just didn't, reduce the standards for what I was supposed to act like, and my academic standards. And I didn't know at the time, but it was really important for my character. It was really helpful to my attitude. It would have further burdened me to think of myself as hopelessly limited, and certainly in your case, your parents didn't even want you to carry the label of autism and have it in your school records. And certainly today there are so many accommodations and understandings and extra services available when you do get on an IEP and all those things, and yet they resisted those temptations, whatever they were at the time.
They did. And no, I think you make a great point of that, when you do hard things, you realize you can do them. Just like your mom realized it for you. That when you push yourself, and I think your mother did probably what my dad did, which was hold my hand through the adversity and encourage me and cheerlead, rather than say, oh, you don't have to. And the next word that I was waiting for you to say is, the victimhood mentality, right? That the one thing that my father just drilled into me is you are not a victim. And that, victimhood is about as addictive as heroin or fentanyl. And it is equally destructive. So that was a big part of his lessons, and a big part of Born Lucky is that idea from him of, I will help you fight, but you better keep fighting.
You talk a lot about the bullying
Mm-hmm.
experiences you had, which were pretty constant even through college.
Mm-hmm.
And you're very gracious. You don't talk about even the office politics in your subsequent jobs. People who were not supportive. You're gracious. You didn't mention names. Was that a hard decision to make in writing your memoir?
Lee, it's a great question. In Born Lucky, we don't use the name of anybody who is mean, right? We don't use the name of the eighth grade teacher who in art class in front of everybody said, "Hey, Vittert, if my dog was as ugly as you, I would shave its bleep and make it walk backwards." Didn't use the name of the principal who told my parents that everybody at the school thought I was weird, including her. And as we started writing it, my co-writer and I went back and forth on this. He really pushed me to want to use the names because it would sort of lend a lot more journalistic credibility to this idea that this is what happened and on and on. And I said, I don't, because two things. One, Born Lucky is not about settling scores. This is about giving hope to every parent and to every kid who's struggling. So knowing the names of people who are mean doesn't matter. It's not that I don't remember the names. I remember them well. But number two, and I'm sure you do too, from when you were a kid, everybody does. You don't forget people who humiliated you. But number two, I did use the name of everybody who was nice to me
Mm-hmm.
because I really wanted people who read it to understand how big of an opportunity they have to make this enormous difference in a kid's life who's struggling.
Mm-hmm.
And how much that's appreciated and how just little kindnesses people don't realize how much of a difference they make.
What made you know that this was the time in your life and this was the time in our culture for you to write this book?
It's a great question. It had absolutely nothing to do with the time and the culture because we had no idea that autism was going to become such an enormous part of the conversation when we wrote Born Lucky. I wanted to write it when I could still get the stories out of my dad
Mm.
and still have conversations with him. And I wanted him to be able to read and understand that I understood the sacrifices he made, right? I wanted him to know that I knew, even though this just came out as I was interviewing him from the book. But, every night, as you pointed out, he would be there to put me back together from the bullying. And he would take me up, I would go sit in my room with him and I would either cry or I would scream. And he would just absorb the emotion of this, either, from when I was 7 or 8 years old all the way through, high school, who was just beat up emotionally and sometimes physically every day. So he absorbed all that. And I didn't know until I started interviewing him for the book that he would then leave my room after I'd gone to bed or started doing homework or whatever. And he would walk downstairs and he would sit in the living room by himself and start crying himself to sleep. I had no idea about that stuff. So I knew there were things I wanted to understand what they were. But these are the darkest moments of my life, right? I mean, Born Lucky is the manifestation of 40 years of some really awful things and some really wonderful things, but some really awful things. And I, didn't go to therapy as a kid, didn't tell anybody about my diagnosis. My dad told no one, no therapist, no teachers, no nothing. So now I'm going to therapy on national television and in podcasts, which is not exactly a fun experience. But if it can give hope to people and give hope to parents and tell parents that there's so much they can do, just like what your mother understood and what my mom and dad understood, but also to tell parents they're not alone. And I can't tell you how many people, the book's been out now for 3 weeks, and there have been hundreds of emails and social media comments of saying, thank you for telling us we're not alone.
Mm.
And that to me is what is really so important on the Born Lucky journey.
You're not a scientist and you're not getting involved in the political debate that RFK is leading, but you did say, I'm so happy that people are open to a conversation about the causes of autism as the scientific question of our time.
Yeah, and I think it should be the scientific question of our time. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a doctor. I have the chemistry grades to prove it. If anybody would like to see them, I still have the report cards. The fact that autism has gone from 1 in about 1,500 when I was diagnosed to 1 in 31 now, 3 times higher for boys, higher still in poor and minority communities. It should be the scientific question of our time. It should be discussed. It should be discussed weekly about how do we find these answers, and hopefully how do we prevent more families from going through what my family went through. And if my wife was pregnant right now, I'm newly married, and I could check a box, either my future child would have autism or not, I would obviously choose no, as would any other parent. So my hope would be that we get to the point that we don't have to have kids going through what I went through. And that to me is the reason that we should, is, as I've written a lot, is RFK the perfect messenger? No. But there are so many people who would rather dismiss RFK as a loon rather than acknowledge we really need to find the answer to this question.
Your message to parents trying to help their kids be more is what from this book?
Well, I think the most important part of the book is the afterword written by my dad. Mm-hmm. The foreword is written by George Will, who said that this book is proof of the mountain-moving power of parental love. The afterword is my dad of sort of summing up his lessons and how he approached things. The middle is my story. And I think really it's parents should take from it what they do from reading it. I think the reason it sort of exploded, we had no idea it was going to be as popular as it was. We ran out of books on Amazon 3 times, and now it's back in stock, is because people responded to it and people heard about it, and this message of hope, and that parents can have so much agency and so much power. And this book really shows them that, and what lessons they take from it is theirs. Mm-hmm.
Well, you did mention, and I saw in the news, you were recently married, and having seen your wife, I can't decide who has the better hair, you or your wife.
Well,
you're blessed to have her.
She is remarkable. And, I had an EQ, or an emotional EQ, about the level of freezing, especially when I was a little boy. I think it's gotten a little better. It's a learned skill. But her EQ is about the temperature of the sun. So she's been a wonderful, wonderful part of my life. And it kind of plays into the title, right? The Born Lucky comes from my nickname from when I was born, what the doctor said, that I was the luckiest baby he'd ever seen. Mm-hmm. The story of that's in Born Lucky. And, lucky, and I'm so grateful, lucky to have had the parents I had, lucky to be alive when I was born, and now lucky to have met such a wonderful woman. Well,
I think maybe that the book could have been called Born Blessed, because I think God has had a hand in all this and is leading you and using you to help others. And I really appreciate your coming on and giving my audience some inspiration too.
Well, thank you, Leah. I appreciate that.
Everyone, go out and get a copy of Born Lucky by Leland Vittert, and thank you so much.
Thank
Bye-bye.
You.
Subscribe and review Conversation Balloons on your favorite podcast platform. Find me at leahfarish.com and on Instagram at LEAHFARISH. This episode is brought to you by the Herzog Foundation. The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of the Herzog Foundation.